The wind that night carried the kind of cold that cut straight through a man's bones. Caleb Rourke pulled his coat tighter as his horse trudged slowly down the narrow street of the settlement called Dry Creek. Snow had piled along the boardwalks and gathered in crooked drifts against the buildings. Lanterns glowed faintly through frosted windows, but most doors were shut tight against the storm. Winter had a way of shrinking frontier towns into quiet, fearful places. Caleb had ridden most of the day through the Wyoming Territory foothills, hoping to reach a warm stable before the storm swallowed the road behind him. Dry Creek wasn't much of a town, half a dozen buildings, a crooked saloon, a feed store, and a sheriff's office that leaned like an old man ready for bed. Still, it was better than freezing on the trail. His horse snorted softly as Caleb dismounted beside the hitching rail outside the saloon. "Easy now, Jasper," he muttered, rubbing the animal's neck. "We made it." Snowflakes drifted steadily through the lamplight. The street looked empty, though faint music drifted from inside the saloon. Caleb stomped the ice from his boots and started toward the door. Then he heard it. A voice, small, thin, so faint he thought at first it might be the wind squeezing between the buildings. "Please." Caleb paused. He turned slowly, scanning the street. Nothing moved except the falling snow. He took another step toward the saloon. Again the sound came. "Please help." This time he knew for certain it wasn't the wind. Caleb stepped back into the street, squinting into the swirling snow. "Hello?" he called out. No answer. Only the hollow whistle of wind against wood. For a long moment he stood there, wondering if his tired mind had imagined it. Then he heard it again. A whisper carried across the frozen street. "Sir, please." The voice was trembling. A child's voice. Caleb's jaw tightened. He stepped away from the saloon and walked slowly down the street, boots crunching in the snow. "Where are you?" he called gently. The wind gusted harder, sending a swirl of powder across the road. Then something moved near the shadow of the feed store. At first he thought it was just a bundle of rags shifting in the wind, but then the bundle took a small step forward. Caleb froze. A tiny figure stood there. A little girl. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old. Her clothes were thin and ragged, little more than patched cloth hanging loosely from her small shoulders. Snow dusted her tangled brown hair, and she was holding herself upright with 2 crude wooden crutches. For a moment Caleb simply stared. The girl's cheeks were bright red from the cold, and her small hands trembled around the handles of the crutches. She looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. "Sir," she whispered. Caleb walked toward her slowly, careful not to startle her. "What in God's name are you doing out here, little one?" The girl shifted her weight on the crutches, wobbling slightly. For a second, Caleb noticed something else. Her left leg ended just below the knee. The ragged hem of her dress hung where the rest of the limb should have been. A quiet ache settled in Caleb's chest. Children weren't meant to endure this kind of world. He crouched down a few steps away from her so he wouldn't tower over her. "What's your name?" he asked gently. The girl hesitated. Then she swallowed. "Lily." "That's a good name," Caleb said softly. "Where are your folks, Lily?" The girl looked over her shoulder, toward the dark space beside the feed store. Then she turned back to Caleb, her eyes filled with tears. "My mama." Her voice shook. Caleb felt a sudden knot form in his stomach. "What about your mama?" he asked carefully. The girl tightened her grip on the crutches. Snowflakes settled on her shoulders. Then she spoke the words that would follow Caleb for the rest of his life. "Please, help my mama first." Caleb's heart dropped. He stood slowly. "Where is she?" Lily lifted one small arm and pointed toward the dark side of the building. "Over there." Caleb moved carefully past the girl, his boots crunching in the frozen snow. The wind howled louder around the corner of the building. At first he saw nothing but shadows. Then his lantern light caught something against the wooden wall. A shape. A person. Someone slumped in the snow. Caleb's pulse quickened. He hurried forward. A woman lay collapsed against the side of the building, her back resting against the boards. Snow had begun to gather on her shoulders and in her hair. Her face was pale, too pale. Caleb knelt quickly beside her and brushed the snow away. "Ma'am?" he said urgently. No response. He pressed his fingers gently to her neck. For a terrifying second he felt nothing. Then, a faint pulse. Weak, but still there. Caleb exhaled slowly. "She's alive," he muttered. Behind him he heard the slow, uneven crunch of Lily's crutches approaching. The little girl stopped beside him. Her small voice trembled. "Is she gonna die?" Caleb looked at the woman again. Her breathing was shallow, too shallow. He had seen this before on the frontier. Cold, exhaustion, maybe sickness, maybe worse. He met Lily's frightened eyes, and for a moment, something old and painful stirred inside him, a memory he had spent years trying to bury. Caleb stood and removed his coat, wrapping it carefully around the unconscious woman. "We're not letting that happen," he said quietly. But as he lifted the woman into his arms, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Deep bruises marked her wrists, and there were fresh boot prints in the snow leading away from the wall. Not one pair, several. Caleb's eyes narrowed. Someone had left her here, and suddenly he knew this night was about to become far more dangerous than he ever expected. The wind curled around the corner of the feed store like a restless animal, throwing loose snow against Caleb's coat as he lifted the woman into his arms. She felt far too light. Not the kind of light that came from a small woman, but the hollow lightness of someone who hadn't eaten properly in days. Caleb adjusted his grip and glanced down at her face. Her skin was pale beneath the frost gathering along her hairline, and her lips had turned a faint bluish color. "She's freezing," he muttered under his breath. Behind him came the uneven scrape of Lily's crutches dragging through the snow. Scrape, step, scrape, step. Caleb looked back at the little girl. She was trying to keep up, her tiny shoulders trembling as she fought to move through the drifts. "Easy there," Caleb said softly. He walked toward her and carefully lowered the woman back against the wall for a moment. Lily's breathing was ragged from the effort. "You shouldn't be standing out here," Caleb said gently. "You're going to freeze yourself." But the girl shook her head stubbornly. "I gotta stay with Mama." Caleb studied her for a long second. Children on the frontier often had to grow strong too soon, but there was something about this little one that struck him deeper than he expected. Maybe it was the crutches. Maybe it was the fierce way she tried to stand tall despite the cold. Or maybe it was the way she looked at her mother, like the whole world rested on that one woman's breath. Caleb crouched down in front of her again. "Lily," he said quietly, "how long has your mama been lying here?" The girl hesitated. Her lower lip trembled slightly. "I don't know. Was she sick?" Lily looked back at her mother. Then she shook her head slowly. "They pushed her." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "Who pushed her?" But the girl didn't answer right away. The wind whistled down the street again, rattling the loose shutters on the feed store. Finally, Lily whispered, "The men." Caleb felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "What men?" "The ones at the big house," she said. Caleb followed her gaze toward the far end of town. Through the drifting snow he could see a large wooden building standing slightly apart from the others. Light glowed through its windows. He recognized it. The town's land office, and above it the rooms where several of the local cattlemen stayed when they rode into town. Men with money, men with power, men who didn't much care about strangers. Caleb stood slowly. "When did this happen?" "Before the snow came," Lily said. "Why would they push your mama?" The girl lowered her eyes. "She asked them for help." Caleb's jaw tightened. "And they did this instead?" Lily nodded faintly. The wind shifted again, sending another gust of snow across the alley. Caleb turned back toward the unconscious woman. Now that he looked closer, the bruises around her wrists made more sense. Not just bruises, finger marks. Someone had grabbed her. Hard. He gently brushed the snow away from her face. "Ma'am," he tried again. Her eyelids fluttered faintly, but she didn't wake. Caleb glanced down at Lily. "What's your mama's name?" "Anna." Well, Lily, he said quietly, we're not leaving Anna out here. The girl nodded quickly, relief flickering across her tired face. Caleb slid one arm beneath Anna's shoulders and another under her legs. Then he lifted her again. This time he didn't hesitate. We're getting her inside. Lily followed beside him, her crutches scraping across the frozen ground as they moved toward the street. As Caleb stepped back into the open road, the wind struck him full in the face again. Snow swirled through the lantern light. The town looked just as quiet as before. Too quiet. Caleb carried Anna toward the saloon first. It was the closest building with warmth and light. He pushed the door open with his shoulder. Instantly, heat and noise rushed out to meet them. A handful of men sat around card tables while a piano clattered softly in the corner. The smell of whiskey and tobacco filled the air. Conversation stopped the moment Caleb stepped inside carrying the unconscious woman. Every head turned. Caleb ignored them and moved toward the bar. Need help, he said simply. The bartender blinked at the sight of the woman in his arms. What happened to her? Freezing, Caleb replied. Need a warm place and a doctor. Before the bartender could answer, a heavy voice came from one of the tables. That ain't your problem, stranger. Caleb turned slowly. A broad-shouldered man with a thick beard leaned back in his chair, studying him with cold eyes. Several other men sat around the same table, cattlemen. Caleb recognized the type immediately. Seems like it is my problem, Caleb said calmly. The man's gaze drifted toward Lily, standing behind Caleb. His expression darkened. Well now, he said slowly. That's an interesting sight. Lily shrank slightly behind Caleb's coat. The man set his cards down. I reckon I seen that woman earlier tonight. Caleb's grip tightened around Anna. Did you? Sure did. The man leaned forward. She and that crippled brat were causing trouble at the land office. A quiet murmur moved through the saloon. Caleb felt Lily flinch behind him. She asked for help, Caleb said evenly. The cattleman laughed. Help? He gestured toward the door. That woman's a squatter. Came here claiming land that ain't hers. That ground belongs to people who actually paid for it. Caleb's voice stayed calm. So you threw her into the snow? The man shrugged. Maybe she should have thought about that before she tried stealing land. Caleb felt anger rise slowly in his chest, but he forced himself to stay steady. This woman's dying, he said. Where's the doctor? The bartender finally spoke. Doc Boone's got a place 2 buildings down. Caleb nodded. Thank you. He turned toward the door again, but as he stepped outside, the bearded cattleman called after him. Stranger. Caleb paused. If that woman dies, the man said coldly, you best not come pointing fingers at us. Caleb looked back over his shoulder. Snow blew through the open doorway. The cattleman's eyes held no regret, only warning. Caleb said nothing. He stepped back into the storm. The wind hit harder now. Lily hurried beside him again, struggling to keep pace. Is Mama going to be all right? She asked quietly. Caleb looked down at the woman in his arms. Her breathing had grown weaker, and something else worried him now. Her skin was burning hot beneath the cold. Fever. Bad fever. He looked toward the small lantern glowing outside Doc Boone's clinic. Let's hope that doctor still remembers how to save someone, Caleb said grimly. But as they approached the clinic door, Caleb noticed something that made him stop in the snow. The lantern outside the building had been turned low, the windows were dark, and nailed across the door was a wooden sign. Closed. Lily's voice trembled beside him. Mister. Caleb stared at the sign. Then he looked back toward the saloon, toward the men inside who had left Anna to die. His jaw tightened. Don't worry, Lily, he said quietly. I'm getting that door open, even if it meant waking the whole town. But as he stepped toward the clinic porch, the door creaked open on its own, and a thin voice whispered from the darkness inside. You'd better come in quick, before those men realize where you've gone. Caleb froze. Someone had been watching them. For a moment, Caleb Rourke didn't move. The wind pushed snow across the wooden porch of Doc Boone's clinic, whispering against the walls like restless ghosts. Lily clutched her crutches tighter beside him. Inside the dark doorway, the thin voice spoke again. Quickly now, before someone sees. Caleb stepped forward. The door opened wider with a slow creak, and a frail old man appeared in the lantern glow. His gray beard was thin and uneven, and round spectacles perched crookedly on his nose. Doc Jeremiah Boone. The old doctor's eyes darted nervously toward the street. "Bring her inside," he said urgently. Caleb wasted no time. He carried Anna through the doorway, Lily hobbling quickly behind. The doctor shut the door fast and slid a heavy wooden bar across it. The small clinic smelled faintly of herbs, whiskey, and wood smoke. A cast-iron stove crackled in the corner, filling the room with much-needed warmth. Caleb laid Anna carefully on the narrow examination bed. Doc Boone leaned over her immediately. "Let me see her hands," he muttered. Caleb stepped aside. The doctor lifted Anna's wrist, his wrinkled fingers gently pressing along the bruised skin. His expression darkened. "Well now," he murmured, "that's not sickness alone." Caleb folded his arms. "That's what I figured." Doc Boone looked toward the door again before speaking. "You crossed paths with the Carter men tonight, didn't you?" Caleb nodded slowly. "The ones in the saloon?" "That'd be them." Doc Boone sighed heavily. "Then you've walked straight into the ugliest business in this town." He turned back to Anna, checking her breathing. "Fever's high," he muttered. "Bad high." Lily had climbed onto a small stool beside the bed. Her tiny hand rested carefully on her mother's arm. "Mama's strong," she whispered. "She always says that." Doc Boone glanced at the girl. For a moment something soft flickered in his tired eyes. "Well," he said quietly, "we're going to need that strength tonight." He moved quickly now, pouring water into a tin basin and reaching for a cloth. Caleb watched silently. After a moment he spoke. "What's this about land?" Doc Boone paused. His shoulders stiffened slightly. "You really don't know?" "No." The doctor wrung out the cloth and placed it gently on Anna's forehead. Then he straightened. "3 months ago," he said quietly, "the railroad surveyors came through here." Caleb listened carefully. "They marked a new line running south of town," Doc Boone continued. "Good land, water nearby, perfect for homesteaders." Caleb nodded. "And the cattlemen don't want it." Doc Boone gave a bitter chuckle. "You catch on quick." He walked to the stove and stirred the fire absently. "The Carter brothers run most of the cattle around here. They've been using that land for grazing for years. But legally, they don't own it." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "So they scare off anyone who tries to claim it." Doc Boone nodded slowly. "Or worse." The wind rattled the clinic windows. Caleb glanced toward Lily. She was whispering softly to her mother, brushing strands of damp hair away from Anna's face. "How long's she been out there?" Caleb asked quietly. Doc Boone sighed. "Long enough. But that's not the worst of it." Caleb looked up. "What do you mean?" The doctor hesitated. Then he reached into the pocket of Anna's coat. "Found this when you carried her in." He unfolded a piece of worn paper. Caleb stepped closer. The paper held an official seal, a land claim certificate. Doc Boone tapped the bottom of the page. "Signed and registered 2 days ago." Caleb studied the document. "Anna Whitaker." Doc Boone nodded. "She legally owns that land now." Caleb felt a slow realization settle in. So the Carter men tried to scare her off. "Looks that way, but when she didn't leave..." Doc Boone finished the thought grimly. "They decided the snow would handle the problem for them." Caleb's jaw tightened. Behind them, Lily's small voice drifted across the room. "Mama, please wake up." Caleb turned. The little girl was fighting back tears. Doc Boone stepped closer to the bed again. He gently checked Anna's pulse. His brow furrowed deeper. "Doc?" Caleb asked. The doctor didn't answer immediately. Finally, he sighed. "She's fighting. But if that fever keeps climbing..." He didn't finish. Caleb understood. The room fell quiet except for the crackling stove. Then Lily spoke again. "Mr. Caleb?" Caleb knelt beside her. "Yes, Lily?" The girl's eyes were red and shining. "Did those men hurt Mama because of me?" Caleb frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" She swallowed. "They got mad when Mama said the land was for both of us." Caleb felt a chill run through him. For both of you? Lily nodded. Mama said it was a place where I could grow up. She lifted one of her crutches slightly. And maybe someday run. The words struck Caleb harder than he expected. Run. The child who could barely stand was dreaming about running. Caleb looked toward the land claim paper again. Suddenly, the situation felt much bigger. This wasn't just a land dispute, it was about a future. A future someone had tried to bury in the snow. Doc Boone placed another damp cloth on Anna's forehead. Then he spoke quietly. There's something else you should know. Caleb turned back. What? The doctor lowered his voice. The Carter brothers don't know she filed that claim yet. Caleb's eyes sharpened. You're sure? Doc Boone nodded. They thought they scared her away before she finished the paperwork. Caleb looked at the paper again. So if she survives, she legally owns the land. The doctor paused. And if the Carter men find out? The wind howled outside. Caleb already knew the answer. They'll finish what they started. Doc Boone nodded grimly. For a moment, the only sound in the room was Anna's shallow breathing. Then something changed. Lily leaned forward suddenly. Mama? Caleb turned quickly. Anna's eyelids fluttered. Her lips moved faintly. Doc Boone rushed closer. Then Lily spoke again. Mr. Caleb? Caleb knelt beside her. Yes, Lily? The girl's eyes were red and shining. Did those men hurt Mama because of me? Caleb frowned slightly. What do you mean? She swallowed. They got mad when Mama said the land was for both of us. Caleb felt a chill run through him. For both of you? Lily nodded. Mama said it was a place where I could grow up. She lifted one of her crutches slightly. And maybe someday run. The words struck Caleb harder than he expected. Run. The child who could barely stand was dreaming about running. Caleb looked toward the land claim paper again. Suddenly, the situation felt much bigger. This wasn't just a land dispute. It was about a future someone had tried to bury in the snow. Doc Boone placed another damp cloth on Anna's forehead. Then he spoke quietly. There's something else you should know. Caleb turned back. What? The doctor lowered his voice. The Carter brothers don't know she filed that claim yet. Caleb's eyes sharpened. You're sure? Doc Boone nodded. They thought they scared her away before she finished the paperwork. Caleb looked at the paper again. So if she survives, she legally owns the land. The doctor paused. And if the Carter men find out? The wind howled outside. Caleb already knew the answer. They'll finish what they started. Doc Boone nodded grimly. For a moment, the only sound in the room was Anna's shallow breathing. Then something changed. Lily leaned forward suddenly. Mama? Caleb turned quickly. Anna's eyelids fluttered. Her lips moved faintly. Doc Boone rushed closer. Easy now, he murmured. Anna's eyes opened slightly. Confusion clouded her face. Oh, Lily? She whispered weakly. The little girl grabbed her hand. I'm here, Mama. Relief filled the room, but it lasted only a second. Anna's gaze shifted past Lily to Caleb. Fear flashed in her eyes. No, she whispered urgently. You have to hide the paper. Caleb leaned closer. Why? Anna struggled to speak. Because... Her voice broke. The Carters are coming back tonight. The words barely left her lips when a loud sound echoed outside the clinic. Hoofbeats, several horses, approaching fast. Doc Boone's face turned pale. Caleb moved toward the window slowly. Through the swirling snow, he saw lanterns moving down the street. At least 4 riders, heading straight for the clinic. Behind him, Lily's small voice trembled. Mr. Caleb, are those the bad men? Caleb's hand rested slowly on the grip of his revolver. His eyes stayed on the approaching riders. Yes, he said quietly, they are. And tonight, they weren't leaving without answers. The sound of horses carried through the storm like distant thunder. Caleb Rourke stood beside the clinic window, watching the lantern lights grow brighter through the curtain of falling snow. 4 riders, maybe 5. Their silhouettes moved steadily down the frozen street toward Doc Boone's building. Inside the clinic, The warmth from the stove suddenly felt thin and fragile. Behind Caleb, Doc Boone whispered nervously, "They found out." Caleb didn't answer. He was counting the riders, watching the way they spread slightly as they approached, men who knew what they were doing. Lily's small voice trembled behind him. "Mr. Caleb?" He turned from the window. The little girl sat beside the bed, clutching her mother's hand with both of hers. Anna Whitaker's eyes were open now, though exhaustion and fever still clung to her face like shadows. "Don't let them take it," Anna whispered weakly. Her gaze moved toward the folded paper lying on the table. The land claim, the one thing standing between the Carter brothers and the land they wanted. Caleb walked over slowly. He picked up the document and studied it again. The official seal glowed faintly in the lamplight. This single piece of paper was worth more trouble than most people realized. To Anna, it meant a home. To Lily, it meant a future. But to the Carter men, it meant losing control. Caleb folded the paper carefully and tucked it inside his coat. Doc Boone stepped closer. "You planning to fight them?" the old doctor asked quietly. Caleb glanced toward the window again. The riders had stopped outside. Lanterns swung gently from their saddles. "I'm planning to buy time," Caleb said. A heavy boot stepped onto the clinic porch outside. The boards creaked loudly under the weight. Then came a knock. Slow, deliberate. Boom, boom, boom. The sound echoed through the small clinic. Lily flinched. Anna squeezed her daughter's hand weakly. Another knock followed. "Doc Boone?" a voice called from outside. Deep, confident. "I know you're in there." Caleb recognized the voice immediately. The bearded cattleman from the saloon. One of the Carter brothers. Doc Boone swallowed nervously. "What do we do?" he whispered. Caleb stepped toward the door. "You stay quiet." Lily's eyes widened. "Are they going to hurt Mama again?" Caleb knelt beside her. "No," he said gently. "Not while I'm here." For a brief moment their eyes met, and Caleb felt something old shift inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. Responsibility. The kind he once had before everything fell apart. He stood again and walked toward the door. Another knock came, harder this time. Boom! "Doc Boone," the voice barked. "Open up." Caleb slid the wooden bar aside slowly. Then he opened the door. Cold air rushed inside immediately, carrying the smell of snow and horse sweat. 4 men stood on the porch. Their coats were thick with frost. The bearded man stood at the front. His eyes narrowed the moment he saw Caleb. "Well now," he said slowly. "The stranger." Caleb leaned casually against the doorframe. "Evening." The man's gaze flicked past him into the clinic. "Doc Boone in there?" "Maybe." The man smiled thinly. "We're looking for a woman." Caleb shrugged slightly. "A lot of those in town." The other riders shifted impatiently behind their leader. Snow blew across the porch. Finally, the bearded man stepped closer. "You picked her up earlier tonight," he said quietly. Caleb met his eyes without blinking. "You mean the woman you left to die in the snow?" The man's smile faded. "You ought to watch how you speak, stranger." Caleb didn't move. "And you ought to learn how to treat people." For a moment the wind filled the silence between them. Then the man chuckled darkly. "You don't understand what's going on here." "Then explain it." The man leaned closer. "That woman is trespassing on land that belongs to us." Caleb shook his head slowly. "Funny thing about land." "What's that?" "You gotta own it first." The other men shifted uneasily. The Carter brothers' eyes hardened. "You planning to make trouble here?" Caleb's voice stayed calm. "I'm planning to keep a sick woman alive." The man studied him carefully now, like a gambler studying a hand of cards. Finally he spoke again. "We're leaving town at sunrise." "So? So if that woman is still here by then?" His gaze turned colder. "She won't be." The threat hung in the frozen air. Behind Caleb he could hear Lily whispering softly to her mother. The Carter man heard it too. His eyes sharpened. "Well now," he murmured. "Sounds like you're hiding more than a patient in there." Caleb stepped forward slightly, blocking the doorway. "You're done here." The man's hand drifted slowly toward the revolver at his hip. "Careful," he said. Caleb didn't move. "Good night." For a long moment the two men stared at each other. Snow drifted between them. Finally the Carter brother laughed again. "You're brave." "Stranger." He stepped back onto the porch. "But bravery don't last long out here." He swung into the saddle of his horse. The other riders followed. Before turning away, the man looked down at Caleb once more. "Sunrise," he said. "After that, she's our problem again." Then the riders turned and disappeared into the snow-covered street. The sound of hoofbeats faded slowly into the storm. Caleb closed the clinic door and slid the bar back into place. Doc Boone let out a long breath. "They'll be back." Caleb nodded. "I know." Lily looked up from beside the bed. "What happens at sunrise?" Caleb walked back to the table and rested his hands on the wood. He thought about the land, about the paper inside his coat, about the men who believed they owned everything around them. Then he looked at Anna. Her eyes were half open again. Fighting. Still fighting. Finally Caleb spoke. "At sunrise," he said quietly, "we decide whether this town belongs to men like them, or to people brave enough to stand their ground." And outside, the storm kept falling. The storm lasted through most of the night. Snow gathered along the windows of Doc Boone's clinic, piling higher and higher against the walls as the wind howled across Dry Creek. Inside, the small room glowed with the quiet orange light of the stove. Caleb Rourke sat beside the bed. He hadn't slept. Every so often he checked Anna's breathing, the way Doc Boone had shown him earlier. The fever had broken some time before dawn, leaving her skin damp and pale but cooler than before. Doc Boone dozed in a chair near the stove, and Lily had finally fallen asleep with her head resting on the edge of the mattress, her tiny hand still wrapped around her mother's fingers. Caleb watched the little girl for a long time. The crutches leaned against the wall beside her, simple pieces of wood, rough, too large for someone so small. He remembered the way she had said it earlier. Maybe someday run, a child's dream, one the world had nearly stolen before it even began. Outside, the wind finally began to quiet. Dawn was coming. Caleb stood slowly and walked toward the window. The sky was turning pale gray behind the clouds. Morning, and with it, the promise the Carter brother had made. Sunrise. Caleb reached inside his coat and removed the folded land claim paper. He studied the official seal again. This little sheet of ink and parchment had nearly cost 2 lives. But now it might save them. Behind him, Anna's voice whispered weakly, "You stayed." Caleb turned. Her eyes were open again, still tired, but clearer now. "You're alive," he said simply. Anna tried to sit up slightly, but the effort made her wince. "Lily? She's right here." The girl stirred as if hearing her name. Then her eyes opened suddenly. "Mama?" Anna reached out. Lily climbed carefully onto the bed and hugged her gently. For a moment the room was filled only with quiet tears and whispered words. Caleb stepped back, giving them space. Doc Boone woke slowly in his chair. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "Looks like you made it through the night." Anna looked toward Caleb. "You saved us." Caleb shook his head. "You were the one fighting." She studied his face carefully. Then her gaze drifted toward the window. "Are they coming back?" Caleb followed her gaze. The town outside was beginning to wake. A few figures moved along the boardwalks. Smoke rose from chimneys. But at the far end of the street, 4 riders waited, just as promised. Doc Boone walked to the window beside Caleb. "Looks like the Carters didn't forget." Caleb folded the land claim paper again. "No." He turned back toward Anna and Lily. "You two stay here." Anna frowned slightly. "What are you going to do?" Caleb looked down at Lily. Then he smiled faintly. "Finish something." He stepped outside. The cold morning air hit him sharply as he crossed the snow-covered street. The Carter brothers were waiting exactly where he expected. 4 men on horseback, watching. The bearded one spoke first. "Morning, stranger." Caleb stopped a few feet away. Morning. The man tilted his head slightly. You come to hand her over? Caleb reached into his coat. The riders tensed slightly, but instead of a gun, Caleb pulled out the folded document. He held it up. What's that? The man asked. A problem for you. Caleb unfolded the paper and tossed it lightly into the snow between them. The Carter brother dismounted slowly. He picked it up, read it, and his face darkened eyes were half open again. Fighting. Still fighting. Finally, Caleb spoke. At sunrise, he said quietly, we decide whether this town belongs to men like them, or to people brave enough to stand their ground. And outside, the storm kept falling. The storm lasted through most of the night. Snow gathered along the windows of Doc Boone's clinic, piling higher and higher against the walls as the wind howled across Dry Creek. Inside, the small room glowed with the quiet orange light of the stove. Caleb Rourke sat beside the bed. He hadn't slept. Every so often he checked Anna's breathing, the way Doc Boone had shown him earlier. The fever had broken some time before dawn, leaving her skin damp and pale but cooler than before. Doc Boone dozed in a chair near the stove, and Lily had finally fallen asleep with her head resting on the edge of the mattress, her tiny hand still wrapped around her mother's fingers. Caleb watched the little girl for a long time. The crutches leaned against the wall beside her, simple pieces of wood, rough, too large for someone so small. He remembered the way she had said it earlier. Maybe someday run. A child's dream. One the world had nearly stolen before it even began. Outside, the wind finally began to quiet. Dawn was coming. Caleb stood slowly and walked toward the window. The sky was turning pale gray behind the clouds. Morning. And with it, the promise the Carter brother had made. Sunrise. Caleb reached inside his coat and removed the folded land claim paper. He studied the official seal again. This little sheet of ink and parchment had nearly cost 2 lives, but now it might save them. Behind him, Anna's voice whispered weakly, You stayed. Caleb turned. Her eyes were open again, still tired, but clearer now. You're alive, he said simply. Anna tried to sit up slightly, but the effort made her wince. Lily? She's right here. The girl stirred as if hearing her name. Then her eyes opened suddenly. Mama? Anna reached out. Lily climbed carefully onto the bed and hugged her gently. For a moment, the room was filled only with quiet tears and whispered words. Caleb stepped back, giving them space. Doc Boone woke slowly in his chair. Well, I'll be, he muttered. Looks like you made it through the night. Anna looked toward Caleb. You saved us. Caleb shook his head. You were the one fighting. She studied his face carefully. Then her gaze drifted toward the window. Are they coming back? Caleb followed her gaze. The town outside was beginning to wake. A few figures moved along the boardwalks. Smoke rose from chimneys, but at the far end of the street, 4 riders waited, just as promised. Doc Boone walked to the window beside Caleb. Looks like the Carters didn't forget. Caleb folded the land claim paper again. No. He turned back toward Anna and Lily. You two stay here. Anna frowned slightly. What are you going to do? Caleb looked down at Lily. Then he smiled faintly. Finish something. He stepped outside. The cold morning air hit him sharply as he crossed the snow-covered street. The Carter brothers were waiting exactly where he expected. 4 men on horseback, watching. The bearded one spoke first. Morning, stranger. Caleb stopped a few feet away. Morning. The man tilted his head slightly. You come to hand her over? Caleb reached into his coat. The riders tensed slightly. But instead of a gun, Caleb pulled out the folded document. He held it up. What's that? The man asked. A problem for you. Caleb unfolded the paper and tossed it lightly into the snow between them. The Carter brother dismounted slowly. He picked it up, read it, and his face darkened. That's fake. No, Caleb said calmly. It's filed and registered. The man crushed the paper in his fist. That land belongs to us. Caleb shook his head. Not according to the law. The other riders shifted uneasily now. Several townspeople had begun gathering nearby, watching the confrontation from a distance. Doc Boone stood outside the clinic. The Carter brother looked around slowly. "You think a piece of paper changes anything out here?" Caleb met his eyes. "No." He rested his hand lightly on his revolver. "But witnesses do." More people stepped onto the street now. Men from the saloon, the blacksmith, even the town clerk. They had all heard what happened the night before, and now they were watching. The Carter brother looked at them, then back at Caleb. For a long moment no one spoke. Finally the man spat into the snow. "This town ain't worth the trouble." He mounted his horse again. "But that woman better stay off our land." Caleb's voice stayed steady. "It's her land." The Carter brothers stared at him one last time. Then he turned his horse. The other riders followed, and slowly they rode out of Dry Creek. The tension drained from the street like a long-held breath finally released. Someone behind Caleb chuckled. "Well, I'll be damned." Caleb turned back toward the clinic. Lily was standing in the doorway, her crutches tucked beneath her arms. She looked at him with wide, hopeful eyes. "Did we win?" Caleb smiled softly. "Yes, Lily, you did." She beamed. Behind her, Anna leaned against the doorframe, still weak but standing. Weeks passed after that morning. Winter slowly loosened its grip on Dry Creek. The snow melted. The rivers swelled with spring water, and just beyond town, on a stretch of land near a quiet creek, a small cabin began to rise. Caleb helped build it himself. Anna worked slowly as her strength returned, and Lily supervised everything from a wooden crate beside the work site. One afternoon, months later, Caleb knelt in the dirt beside her. He held something in his hands, a carefully carved wooden leg, smooth, balanced, built to fit. Lily stared at it with wide eyes. "For me?" Caleb nodded. "We'll need to practice." She looked at the open field beyond the cabin. The grass was turning green again. Then she looked back at him. "Do you think I could run someday?" Caleb smiled. "I think," he said gently, "you're going to surprise us all." Years later, people in Dry Creek would still talk about the winter a little girl stood in the snow and begged a stranger for help. But the story they remembered most was the day that same girl took her first running steps across her own land.